In the summer of 1807, in the warm, dusty streets of Nîmes, a young shoemaker was counting days instead of coins. Pierre Picaud had done everything right. He worked with his hands, kept his head down, saved what little he could, and somehow, improbably, had fallen in love with a woman far above his station. She was wealthy, well-connected, the kind of woman people whispered about in markets and taverns, and she had chosen him anyway. The wedding date was set, the ring was bought, the suit was waiting. Pierre was days away from stepping into a life he never believed would be his. And then, just before everything became real, 4 men decided he shouldn't have it. They didn't confront him, they didn't challenge him, they didn't accuse him of anything he'd actually done. They destroyed him with a lie whispered to the authorities at exactly the wrong moment, during exactly the wrong war, to ensure that Pierre Picaud would disappear quietly and permanently. That lie would turn a quiet shoemaker into one of the most patient, methodical, and terrifying architects of revenge Europe has ever produced. This is the true story behind the Count of Monte Cristo, and the real version is darker. History is usually told through wars, emperors, and grand events. But today we're looking at something smaller, something familiar, stories that prove humans have never really changed. This is Same Old Humans. Pierre Picaud wasn't ambitious in the way history usually remembers ambition. He didn't seek power or prestige. He wasn't a soldier chasing medals or a merchant chasing fortunes. He wanted something much simpler: stability, respect, and a family. Shoemaking was honest work. Long hours bent over leather, hands permanently stained, the smell of glue and hide following you home. Pierre was good at it, reliable, the kind of man people trusted with their boots and, eventually, their money. And somehow, against all expectations, he won the affection of a wealthy young woman from Nîmes. Her family was uneasy. A shoemaker wasn't what they had imagined. But she insisted. She chose Pierre. And in a town where everyone watched everyone else, that choice didn't go unnoticed. In that moment, without knowing it, she painted a target on his back. Because people don't just envy wealth, they envy escape. Pierre had 3 men he drank with regularly, men he thought of as friends, or at least companions. Mathieu Lupion, a tavern owner, loud, charismatic, and always watching who came and went. François Solari, a tailor, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, constantly measuring himself against others. Antoine Alou, a schemer, slippery, the sort of man who always knew where to be without ever explaining why. And a 4th man whose name history never bothered to preserve, which somehow makes him feel more real. They watched Pierre rise, watched him win the affection of a woman none of them could have, watched him step toward a life they felt entitled to resent. Some accounts suggest Lupion wanted Pierre's fiancée for himself. Others imply the men simply couldn't stand the idea that a shoemaker might climb higher than they ever would. Whatever the motive, they agreed on the method. For a while, nothing happened. Pierre laughed with them, drank with them, planned his wedding. And somewhere in the background, a decision was being made without him. They went to the authorities and accused Pierre of being an English spy. In 1807, during the Napoleonic Wars, that accusation didn't need evidence. It only needed timing. Pierre was arrested on the eve of his wedding, dragged away in chains, disappeared into stone. His fiancée never saw him again. Pierre was sent to the fortress of Fenestrelle, a massive stone prison wedged into the Alps, cold even in summer, where men were buried alive behind walls of granite and bureaucracy. 7 years passed there, 7 winters, 7 summers that never warmed the stone, 7 years of damp walls, rationed food, and the slow erosion of hope. Pierre didn't know it yet, but prison wasn't where his life ended. It was where it was quietly rebuilt, habit by habit, thought by thought, piece by piece. Time in prison doesn't move evenly. Some days stretch endlessly, others vanish without memory. Pierre learned to survive by narrowing his world: meals, sleep, routine. Survival first, hope later. It was there he met Father Torri, an Italian priest, older, educated, quiet, imprisoned for reasons no one bothered to explain anymore. Tori saw something in Pierre: intelligence, discipline, patience, and began teaching him. Languages, mathematics, history, philosophy, not to pass time, to sharpen him. And as Tori grew ill, he revealed a secret he had carried for decades, a secret so enormous it would reshape Pierre's destiny. Tori confessed that he had hidden a fortune, a massive treasure in Milan. Gold, jewels, bonds, enough wealth to change a man's life forever. And he told Pierre exactly where it was. Even Pierre didn't believe it at first. Men in prison hear stories like this all the time, fantasies meant to soften despair. Why Pierre? Because Tori had no family left, and because he believed Pierre was the only man who deserved it. When Tori died in his arms, Pierre inherited not just a treasure map, but a purpose. He swore 2 vows. He would find the treasure. He would take revenge on the men who betrayed him. And when Napoleon fell in 1814, the prison doors opened. Pierre Picaud walked out a free man. But he wasn't the same man who walked in. Pierre travelled to Milan, found Tori's treasure exactly where the priest said it would be, and overnight became a wealthy, powerful man. But he didn't return to France as Pierre Picaud. He returned as someone else, a gentleman of means, dressed in fine Italian tailoring, speaking with a polished accent, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had been reborn. He had spent 7 years imagining what he would do if he ever got out. Now he had the money to make it real. Pierre didn't storm back into Nîmes demanding justice. He didn't shout his story from the rooftops. Instead, he slipped quietly into the edges of the city, watching from a distance as life went on without him. He studied the people who had forgotten him, listened for whispers of the past he'd lost, and slowly pieced together the lives of the men who had betrayed him. And what he discovered hardened his heart even further. His former fiancée, believing Pierre dead, had married Mathieu Lupion, the very man who had orchestrated his downfall. That was the final spark. Pierre began constructing a revenge plan so intricate it feels like fiction. But it wasn't. The 4 targets: François Solari, the tailor; the unnamed conspirator, the weakest link; Antoine Alou, the schemer; Mathieu Lupion, the ringleader. Each would face a different kind of justice. Each would meet a different Pierre. Pierre began with François Solari, the tailor who talked too much and thought too little. Solari was a tailor, a man of modest means, predictable habits, and a fondness for gossip. Pierre chose him first because he was the easiest to manipulate, the easiest to break. Pierre rented a room across from Solari's shop under a false name. For weeks he watched the man's routine unfold like clockwork. The early mornings, the long afternoons bent over fabric, the evenings spent drinking too much wine and complaining about customers. He noticed the little things too, the way Solari flinched when someone mentioned money, the way he lingered near gambling tables but never won, the way he bragged loudly when he felt insecure. Pierre filed it all away. One afternoon, dressed like a wealthy traveller, Pierre walked into Solari's shop. He complimented the tailor's work, ordered expensive garments, and tipped generously. Solari, flattered and greedy, welcomed him like a long-lost friend. Over the next few weeks, Pierre became Solari's best customer, then his confidant, then the man Solari tried to impress. And one night, after enough wine, Solari let his guard down. He laughed about the time he and a few others had denounced a man named Pierre Picaud. Pierre didn't react. He simply poured more wine. Pierre hired 2 criminals, men who believed they were collecting a gambling debt. He gave them Solari's schedule, his route home, and the exact alley where Solari always stopped to relieve himself after drinking. One night, Solari wandered into that alley, humming to himself, drunk and oblivious. He didn't notice the 2 figures waiting in the shadows until they stepped forward, blocking the moonlight. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was already too late. Solari never made it out of that alley. The town whispered, robbery. Pierre whispered nothing. 1 was gone, 3 were still breathing. The next man on Pierre's list didn't even earn a name in the records, a reminder of how insignificant he truly was. Pierre didn't waste theatrics on him. He simply removed him from the board. Pierre learned the man's habits. Every Thursday evening he drank at the same tavern, always ordering the same wine. Pierre bribed the tavern boy. A pinch of arsenic in a bottle, nothing dramatic. The man fell ill that night and died within days. Doctors blamed fever of the stomach. Pierre crossed another name off the list, the easiest name to cross off. The others would take more care. There was Antoine Alout, the slippery one, the paranoid one, the man who thought he could outrun his past. Alout was different. He was clever, suspicious, and always looking over his shoulder. He had left Nîmes and moved to Paris, where he lived among petty criminals and half-formed schemes. Pierre followed him there. For weeks, Pierre shadowed Alout through the twisting streets of Paris, through markets, taverns, and dimly lit alleys. Alout began to feel it. He started glancing behind him, changing his routes, sleeping with a knife under his pillow. Pierre wanted him afraid. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Pierre cornered Alout in a narrow street. Alout recognized him instantly, or rather, recognized the ghost he thought was dead. He begged, he cried, he confessed everything. Pierre listened quietly, letting the man spill every detail of the betrayal. Then he stabbed him. Alout collapsed, bleeding into the dirt. Pierre walked away. But Alout didn't die. He crawled to safety and survived. Alout's survival left a single thread dangling, a thread Pierre didn't notice, not yet, because his attention had already shifted to the man who had orchestrated everything, Mathieu Lupien. Lupien was the architect of Pierre's downfall. He had married Pierre's former fiancée. He had built a respectable life. He had children. He had everything Pierre had lost. Pierre didn't want to kill him quickly. He wanted to dismantle him, piece by piece. Pierre returned to Nîmes under yet another identity, this time as a wealthy gentleman seeking a tutor for his children. Pierre's first move was simple: slip into Lupien's household like a shadow, quietly, patiently, becoming a trusted presence before anyone realized he was even there. He befriended Lupien's family, charmed them, and became a regular guest in their home. Lupien never recognized him. Why would he? Pierre had changed too much, in dress, in speech, in manner, and Lupien had never expected the dead to return. Once he was inside the family's orbit, Pierre turned his attention to Lupien's son, the first pillar he intended to break. Lupien's son was young, hot-tempered, and desperate to be seen as important. Pierre noticed it immediately. He didn't rush. He watched, listened, learned who the boy wanted to impress, and who he wanted to be feared by. He fed him opportunities, small ones at first, a chance to boast, a chance to take a risk. Then Pierre began to tighten the circle. Whispers reached the right ears. Documents appeared where they shouldn't have. Witnesses remembered things a little differently than they had before. By the time the accusation came, theft from a wealthy merchant, the boy was already trapped inside a story he didn't know he'd been cast in. The trial was brief. The sentence was death. Lupien's family was shattered. Pierre watched from the crowd. After the sun fell, Pierre shifted his focus to the daughter, unraveling the second thread in Lupien's carefully built life. Pierre arranged for her to be kidnapped by criminals he controlled. She was forced into prostitution in a distant town. Lupien searched for her desperately. Pierre knew exactly where she was. He never told. And then came the moment Pierre had been building toward for years. The final blow. With his family destroyed, his reputation ruined, and his finances collapsing, Lupien was a broken man. That's when Pierre revealed himself. He confronted Lupien in a quiet street. Lupien stared at him, confused at first, then horrified. Pierre told him everything: the prison, the treasure, the revenge. Lupien begged for mercy. Pierre stabbed him through the heart. The ringleader was dead. Pierre's revenge was complete. Or so he thought. Remember Antoine Alout, the conspirator who survived? He had pieced together the pattern of deaths. He knew Pierre was behind them, and he wanted revenge of his own. One evening, as Pierre walked alone, a loot ambushed him. He stabbed him repeatedly, the same way Pierre had stabbed Solari, the same way he had stabbed him. Pierre Picaud died in the street. His body was found with a journal, a detailed account of everything he had done. That journal is how we know this story, his legacy. Alexandre Dumas eventually stumbled across Pierre Picaud's case in the police archives and turned it into the Count of Monte Cristo. But the real story? It's darker, more brutal, more human. Pierre Picaud didn't ride off into the sunset. He didn't reclaim his lost love. He didn't rebuild his life. He died as he lived after prison, consumed by vengeance. And that's where his story leaves us, standing in the uncomfortable space between justice and obsession, wondering how a quiet shoemaker became a man who could dismantle 4 lives with the patience of a saint and the precision of a surgeon. Pierre Picaud's tale might feel like something that could only happen in the 1800s, a world of taverns and tailors, secret treasures, and long, simmering revenge. But if you strip away the cobblestones and the candlelight, what you're left with is something that hits a little too close to home. Because you don't need a fortress prison or a hidden fortune to understand what was burning inside him. If you've ever replayed a betrayal long after everyone else moved on, if you've ever imagined the perfect reckoning, the perfect apology, the perfect moment where someone finally realizes what they did to you, if you've ever thought, even quietly, one day they'll regret it, then you already understand Pierre better than you'd like to admit. We like to pretend we're more civilized now, that we've traded vendettas for therapy, duels for subtweets, and long-nursed grudges for blocking and moving on. But the human heart hasn't updated its software in centuries. We still bruise the same way. We still crave justice the same way. And sometimes, if we're honest, we still daydream about revenge the same way. Different century, different tools, different ways of keeping score. But the emotions, the grudges, the quiet fantasies of seeing someone get what we think they deserve. Same old humans. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, you're probably not alone. If you enjoy stories that prove people have always been like this, subscribe for more. Same old humans.